am a saxophonist, Dana Stevens. I live in Paterson, New Jersey, and thank you for joining this masterclass. I am going to cut to the chase and jump right into it. So when improvising, I think it's important to right away split the whole concept of improvising into two categories: what and how. So the what we're going to play is kind of like pentatonics or scales or arpeggios. It's the content, the actual notes of what we're playing. The other side of it is more of what I want to focus on today. We will get into a little bit of what, but not so much. And that's the how. And that's the thing that makes Coltrane, and Sonny Rollins, all of our masters have this unique how. So I think jazz is obviously one of those musics that is geared towards the individual's unique perspective on playing these same 12 notes we've had for centuries now. So the first thing I want to get into is dynamics. Now, there's many ways to express dynamics. Naturally, when we're playing, we tend to play louder as the notes go higher. So these are kind of natural dynamics, but during the course of a solo, we can also think of the dynamics and how they're changing over the course of a solo. The beginning of the solo is going to be soft and it ends loud, so it's a gradual dynamic change. Or you can think about dynamics within the context of one line, one idea. So maybe the line starts off loud and then gets soft, or maybe the opposite, or maybe there's a combination of the two. So I'll play a line that, let's try a line, I'll play a line that starts off soft and gets loud. Right? So, and they got a little soft at the end too. So why don't I try the other way? Start off loud and then go soft, right? Has a unique effect, right? It really draws the listener in because they don't know what you're going to do dynamically. And almost when you get soft, it almost brings the listener in to kind of hear what you're playing. And another way is just to keep the dynamic flat all the way through. That has an effect as well. Although over time, I feel that could be, dare I say boring? I don't want to say boring, but that could make things a little less engaging. But here's a line that's the same volume all the way through. So there's something to it. You know, there's still articulation, all these other hows. So let's look at another how. Let's look at range. Now, the saxophone is about 2.5 octaves, and in comparison to other instruments like piano, guitar, that's a pretty limited range. But even within that limited range, we can section off a part of that range and say, let's just improvise within that smaller section of the range of the saxophone and see what happens. So I've got an ideal, a test song that we'll use throughout this masterclass, and it's simply a blues and B-flat concert. So with the exception of that last note, which was a G on tenor saxophone, I kept the range really narrow between high B flat and high E. Everything within those changes that were going by, I kept in a very narrow range. So it almost forces you to be more creative in making it not boring, not a boring solo. So you end up relying more on rhythm. I didn't do much volume there, but I was playing around with the rhythm a little bit. Now I'm going to do another example where I play everything, let's say, anything below low F. So it's going to be kind of maybe meaty and in the way of the bass a little bit, but that's okay. All right. So I did cheat, if you guys were listening. I did play an F sharp. I broke my rule slightly, but you get the idea. So now let's take a look at another really important aspect of improvising, and that's pacing. And what I mean by pacing is, where are you leaving space? And how often are you leaving space? So space has many advantages. One of the main advantages is that it allows the people you're playing with to digest the information you just gave them. You probably put a lot of expression into what you just played, and to follow it up with something that's maybe just as complicated or that just keeps going and going with no space doesn't allow us, the listeners, or the people you're playing with to really digest what you played and even maybe perhaps react to what you just played. One of the greatest exemplars of using space is Miles Davis. I'm pretty sure many of you guys have heard that name and have heard at least Kind of Blue. If you haven't, I highly recommend checking that album out, Kind of Blue. And in contrast, someone like Coltrane, who's on this record, doesn't use actually, to be honest, everyone else on that record doesn't use as much space as Miles does. But that's actually a nice contrasting element of that record. So pacing, how often are you going to play? And when it's more about when you're going to play. It's almost another element. We talked about what and how, but this is when to play. And I kind of stuffed that into the how category. So here's an example, our same blues. And I'm going to do one chorus where it's just kind of all together, not using much space. And then I'm going to do another chorus where I'm being careful, or I'm just leaving more space for digestion. So that last chorus, I even took more space. And actually, during the 4 chord, if you're following along with the blues form here, in the 4 chord, in that last chorus, I left so much space that the fake comper in iReal Pro played a rhythm that I was able to actually interact with. Another really good advantage of doing that for us as a player is it allows us to digest what we just played, and perhaps if there was a theme in there, a grabbable theme, we could take that and develop it. And that space gives us a bit more time to really craft that embellishment or that going along of the motif of the idea that we just came up with. And if you're not going to develop that theme that you just came up with, the space will give you more time to think clearly about what it is you do want to play next. So there's just oogles of reasons to practice using space. Now, oftentimes when we're improvising in front of people, there's there's a bit of nervousness, perhaps. We feel anxious, so we tend to not. That's the one thing we tend to not think about is using space. But it's also again the one thing that's going to actually center us and probably relieve that anxiety and make us more confident. So interaction, another important thing that can happen naturally, especially when you use space. So another how is articulation. Now, this is one of those things that's very personal to the player as well. The concept of articulation may be common between player to player, but the way each individual does it is very unique to them. So let's look at I guess you would say, I like to narrow it down to three main ways to articulate: legato, staccato, and what we'll, just for the purposes of this class, we'll call jazz phrasing. And that's the concept of tonguing every other note. And we'll get to that in a second. So first, legato, right? What are the advantages of playing legato? Well, first of all, if you're practicing a new scale or anything new, that may be a bit challenging, I think it's really important to practice with no articulation. Maybe now is the time to bring up that using your tongue to dictate the notes. That means that your tongue is dictating the time, and that also means that your fingers could be a little bit sloppy since your tongue is the one that's dictating the time. When you play all legato, that means you have to really practice and make sure your fingers are also playing in sync with the time. So that's one phrasing, and I often practice scales in these three main articulations. Staccato, I mean, this is just a good exercise for working out, getting used to using your tongue, and playing staccato and having that flexibility and being able to use it whenever you need it. Now, the jazz phrasing, for playing eighth notes, it's tonguing into every other note, meaning instead of, which is all staccato, right? So it's ta, 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 instead of ta, 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 or ta, 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 ta. Right, so that sounds, for my taste, a little bit herky-jerky. Now, you can make it that same kind of phrasing a little bit more legato, but still tongue in the same places, but make it a little bit more legato, right? Versus, right? So, and it's good to be able to do both and have a few of these different ways of playing this jazz phrasing in your toolbox. So let's move on. Another important thing that's really just a very expressive how, if you will, is vibrato. Now, I think this is another thing that really is, it's up to the individual. It's really unique to the individual that's using the vibrato. If you listen to John Coltrane in the 50s through the early 60s, he did not use much vibrato at all, maybe at the tail end of notes. But then after about 65, he used a lot of vibrato. So that's someone throughout the course of their career changing their vibrato. There's also players that have sometimes within a song or within a line, even within a note, a long note, they'll hold it straight and then use a little vibrato at the end, or maybe beginning and then go straight. There's many ways to play with a vibrato. So here's a couple of ways. Right, so I kind of was playing it straight and then using the vibrato more towards the end. but it can be all vibrato. And I'm thinking, mainly because of the song, I'm thinking of Coleman Hawkins a bit. So it's important, again, be able to play all of these different varieties of vibrato and not have a set way of doing it. This brings me to a model that I always use when teaching privately or with a big group when I'm talking about improvisation. I think it's important to not have any defaults, right? So the default might be to have no vibrato. Therefore, to make no vibrato not a default, it's important to practice vibrato so that when you're choosing what to do, straight or vibrato, you're choosing, not defaulting to one or the other. And in turn, you're having a lot more control over what's happening, and you can even surprise the listener by choosing one way or the other, but mainly not having a default. So here's another how that we should keep in mind as reed players and woodwind players in general, and that's the attack of the note itself. Now, are we using a tongue attack or a breath attack? And now, it's a subtle but definite thing. And when you're playing something slow like a ballad, like Body and Soul or something, these little details really make a big difference, right? So a tongue attack will be... whereas a breath attack... right, so it's a little softer, and I think in a ballad I almost prefer that attack. But there's no rule saying you can't do that in a fast tune as well. Right, it doesn't matter the note qualities you're playing, it just matters about the attack. Now the same thing with the end of the note. You can cut off the note with your tongue, or you can just allow the air inside to stop, which has a smoother ending. Here's a tongue release, if you will. And here's a breath release. So again, a little smoother. I'll probably use that more in ballads and whenever possible, honestly. This is, I can say for me, my default for many years was to tongue everything. Tongue the beginning, tongue the end of the note. Very dictatorial, if you will, with my tongue, no pun intended. But when I'm listening, I kind of prefer the breath attack. So, and breath release in many cases. So again, no defaults. Another thing we can think about is time feel, right? Here's the time. Boom, boom, boom. Now, are we going to be ahead of the time or behind the time or right down the center of the time? So I was behind at first, then I was ahead a lot, almost uncomfortably so. And I'm going to put it right down the middle. Right? So we can do a little bit of both within one line. Start ahead, end up behind, go ahead, you know. you get the idea. So you can play around with that. I recommend always, when you're working on something new, especially, record yourself. I think it's a very important thing to hear what you sound like when you're not in the act of creating, and when you have all of the sensitivities and anxiety that go with improvising. So record yourself, and listen to yourself. And don't be hard on yourself when you do so. You're really listening to just look for aspects that could use some improvement. Yeah. Be honest. Now let's talk about some hows that are very specific to the saxophone. So false fingerings, I want to introduce those to you. Now, when you're playing middle B flat, B, C, C sharp, or D, right in the middle of the saxophone, there's false fingerings for all of those notes. And generally what it is, with the exception of the D, which we'll get to last, all of the false fingerings are actually the fingering that corresponds to the note one octave below. So middle B flat, to get the false fingering for middle B flat, you'll play low B flat and go back and forth like this. Right? So normal low B flat, but false fingering B flat, low B flat, if you will. So the same thing for B, C, and C sharp. Now D is a different false fingering for that. You want to play middle D as normal, and instead of playing the fingering that's an octave below, what you're actually going to do is play the side D, which is normally played for an octave higher. So that sounds like. So it doesn't sound as drastic. It's not as different sounding as the B flat, B natural, C, and C sharp are, but it is definitely a different tone quality, as you can hear. And some players, I can hear in certain recordings, Michael Brecker using that fingering, and also Dexter Gordon is a common false fingering for middle D. And some people, it almost sounds like they prefer that fingering over the normal fingering. So you hear this a lot, especially if you listen to blues players. King Curtis, many players in the blues genre that will use that as a different color for that note to really accentuate that. I'm thinking of Arnett Cobb as well. Great player. Definitely recommend checking him out. So the other false fingerings for saxophone that are similar to that are actually the same notes, B flat, B natural, C, and C sharp, and D, but up one octave. So now we're playing high B flat, and still the same fingering that we use for the middle B flat, you can use for false fingerings in the higher register. So I'm playing high B flat, and then I'm fingering low B flat while playing high B flat. And if your embouchure stays the same, you'll get that effect. Just make sure you're not trying to actually play from high B flat to low B flat. It would sound messed up. So here's an example of B flat. High B flat, that is. C, and C sharp. And then again for D is different than all the others. And this time you're playing high D and fingering the middle D. Or it could be the low D. Same fingering, right? So, and it sounds really cool playing little patterns between all of those different notes. Right? Now, all the other notes that aren't those B flat, B, C, C sharp, and D in those different octaves, you can find false fingerings for those as well. Like A is a common one. You would finger D for A. Middle D or low D, but keep the octave key on. For A flat, you would finger D flat. Middle G, you would finger C. F sharp, you would finger B. F, you would finger B flat. There's several that'll work on different notes, right? Some notes, there are several different false fingerings that'll work. And I recommend you diving in and finding them, see which work the best. Now, I'll just touch on this a little bit. There's 2, perhaps 3, depending on how much you work at it, chords. Yes, I said chords that you can play on the saxophone, but there's only 2. It's a C triad and a B triad. Now, to get the C triad, you have to finger A and open, you have to, finger A and open E flat. And it's right in the middle between it. When you play that fingering, playing E flat and opening the side E flat, you can play with your embouchure and you'll find it real easy. Both of these with the octave key, by the way. The next one is playing B flat and opening your E key, which you may see here, which is fingered here. Now, the other one I mentioned, which is with this particular setup I have, I'm not able to get it out. It's actually pretty difficult to get out, but the way you would do it is finger B and open the high F key, which is this one here. I can't get it right now. And another one that's below the C triad is playing A flat, high A flat, and opening the palm D. Your neighbors and your parents or whoever is around you may not want you to practice this for too long, but it is a cool little thing to do, especially if you're in the key of C and you know that fingering right away. Anyway, practice, you can mess around with that. So the next thing that's very saxophone specific I want to talk about are, and I got this really when I was playing a lot of F blues and playing kind of, and I'm saying F concert, which is G on tenor saxophone, and for alto that would be a B flat blues, but G on the saxophone, whichever saxophone you're playing, and really works in either octave, but I'll use the high octave for now. And you're using basically this high E key as a trill for the notes B flat, B, C, C sharp, and D. And E flat also. It's just, that's a normal trill between E flat and E. So, but it works for the next few notes going down as well. So starting from B flat. Cool little, just like spontaneous random thing you can bring out in the middle of a solo, or in a blues. The cool thing is, you can put it wherever you see fit. You can even write a song around it if you want to, using those different trills. So now I want to talk about the what. Now, the what, in my eyes, contains rhythms and notes. So we can split the what into two, if you will. So right now, let's think about rhythm. When we're playing rhythm and we're improvising, and if we're playing with a band, I think it's really important to realize that there's a lot of rhythm going on around you. In general, the bass player is playing bass notes, but sometimes, and you can play this. There's nothing preventing us from playing the same rhythm on the saxophone, right? Almost pretend like you're a bass player, but 2 octaves or 3 octaves higher, right? Depending on which saxophone you're using. The pianist is playing a comping rhythm that complements over that, right? So let's see what iReal Pro rhythm is doing. It's not usually too advanced on here, but there are some rhythms. I'm going to speed up the pace a bit. Now, when it really gets interesting is when you start stealing from the drummer, because they are most of the rhythmic content and a lot of the color that's happening, low and high with the cymbals, right? The bass drum's the low. So there's several different rhythms happening at once, usually with the drummer, right? You got ding, ding, da ding, ding, da ding, ding, da ding, which, yes, you may realize that's very close to what the bass player is doing, rhythmic-wise. So that's happening, ding, ding, da ding. And then there's this, what many people call different things, but what's happening on the snare drum, the comping pattern that they're using on the snare drum. It's great for us soloists, whether we're playing piano or whatever, but saxophonists especially, to take what's happening in the drums and what's happening specifically on the snare, right? And see if we can, again, not mimic, but complement and go along with that. So the app that I'm using now is called Drum Genius. And the genius thing about it, if you will, is that it has many different drummers as samples, if you will. Actually, they've transcribed them and put them, I'm not sure how they did it, to be honest, but it's not the real drummers themselves, but it's the exact same rhythms placed exactly where that drummer would place them, and it's recognizably these unique drummers. And that's actually a really interesting way to recognize the uniqueness of everyone's expression in improvising and playing. You have 4 or 5,000 different drummers playing the exact same rhythms, but they all sound uniquely them if you listen closely, right? So I was just using Mickey Roker in the medium swing section of Drum Genius. Now I'm going to use Philly Joe Jones, another drummer I super love. The drummers will love you immediately when they hear you communicating with them. And it makes it more engaging, again, for the players you're playing with, to leave the space, but also to interact with what they're doing. So another important thing is to listen to your players very closely. When you get real deep into it, if there's a communication happening between piano and sax or piano and drums, when there's audible, not visible, but audible communication, that's very engaging for everyone within earshot of what's happening. So another really important thing to consider in the what category is note value. Now in jazz, we tend to play many, many eighth notes. And if we're not careful, our whole solo will be nothing but eighth notes, eighth notes, eighth notes, eighth notes. And that becomes very predictable. And the cool thing about jazz is that it can be spontaneous. That's the whole act of, that's the whole point of improvising. That's the whole coolness and, that's the thing that we all love about jazz is that spontaneity, that feeling of not knowing what's going to happen next. So in order to make eighth notes not a default, but a choice, it's important to practice all of the other note values that are out there. We have eighth notes, but we also have eighth note triplets. We have dotted eighth notes, right? We have quarter notes triplets, dotted quarter notes, half note triplets, dotted half notes. We also have 16th notes if the tempo is at the right tempo, if it's not too fast. Especially at a ballad, we have 16th notes, dotted 16th notes, if available, again, if it's not really burning in tempo, and a 16th note triplets as well, right? So we have all of these different note values at our disposal, and we want to make sure that we're not just playing eighth notes. So what I do, we'll go back to our blues and B flat concert here, and just play a chorus with just quarter notes and see what that limitation brings out of you. How do you creatively get around that? How do you improvise with quarter notes? How does that make you sound different, right? All of those other hows that we talked about before are still at our disposal. Articulation, whether it's going to be short, staccato, legato, volume, dynamics, where you're leaving space. You still have all of those at your disposal. So when you think about being limited to quarter notes, and it may sound very restrictive, but it's really not that restrictive when you think of all the different ways you can play it. When you put all the different hows, all of your unique hows into it. So let's take dotted quarter notes. So let's try, and you've heard them to this point already in some of my improvisations, but let's try triplets, eighth note triplets. Now let's try some half notes. So now let's do a combination of all. Now I'm not going to tell you which one I'm going to play, but I'm not going to play just eighth notes. I may not play any eighth notes, right? You get the idea. Now, we didn't get much into scales and things like this. I imagine there's many other master classes that deal with the harmony in great detail. But I really want to just distinguish between all the different ways you can play the same material. And the way you develop it is by practicing all the different rhythms, all the different ways, all the different attributes. So this reminds me of a saying that I got from Carl Allen. And the saying is, everything complicated is made up of simpler little parts just put together. So when we dive into those little parts and work on them individually, maybe it's dynamics, articulation, all the different hows that we talked about. And then we got the whats, the different rhythms, not including the different scales that you all are learning and will continue to learn. I'm still learning new skills myself at 42. So when we think of all of the different hows and whats that are available, it gives us a lot of room to find our own unique voice in this music, just like anyone that we love out there. All the masters, whether it's Sarah Vaughan, Charlie Rouse, John Coltrane, Louis Armstrong, Ornette Coleman. You can go down the list of all of these greats that we know. The thing that made them them is they had their own unique voice. And that, to me, is almost, if not more important than all the little technical tricks and which are cool, but how are we doing them? Is it uniquely ours? The way we're playing them, is it ours, I should say? So with all that said, I would like to thank you for being here and checking out this masterclass, and I look forward to hopefully someday in person hearing your unique voice and to hear what you do with all of these possibilities that we have at our disposal in jazz. Thanks a lot. Take care.